In 1973, Arab nations didn't ban oil exports. They just restricted who could buy it and how much. Oil prices quadrupled in 6 months. In 2010, China didn't ban rare earth metals. They just required special licenses and approvals. Prices shot up 800% overnight. In 2023, China didn't ban gallium exports. They just created a managed approval system. The West is still scrambling for alternative supplies 3 times. 3 critical materials, 3 market disruptions, all using the exact same playbook. Export controls, not export bans. And here's what should terrify you. China just announced the same licensing system for silver export starting in 2026. Not a ban, but something far more dangerous. A valve they can turn whenever they want. Silver markets are already running deficits every single year. Western buyers depend on Chinese refined silver to fill the gap. When that valve starts closing, the price won't just rise gradually. It will explode violently, and most people won't even understand what hit them. The modern resource war operates through bureaucracy rather than battlefields, fought with licensing requirements and regulatory frameworks instead of tariffs and trade embargoes. When governments seek to control critical material flows without triggering international retaliation, they deploy export management systems that technically maintain legal commerce while practically strangling supply chains. This mechanism transforms open markets into controlled funnels, creating artificial scarcity through administrative complexity rather than outright prohibition. The distinction between total export bans and state-administered export controls represents the difference between crude economic warfare and sophisticated market manipulation. Traditional bans generate immediate diplomatic backlash and legal challenges through international trade organizations, forcing governments to defend politically costly positions. Export licensing systems accomplish the same supply disruption while maintaining plausible deniability, requiring potential exporters to navigate approval processes, demonstrate compliance histories, meet minimum production thresholds, and submit to end-use scrutiny before conducting any international transactions. The architecture of managed exports creates bottlenecks at every stage of the approval process. Governments can demand extensive documentation, impose waiting periods for license reviews, require specific certifications from approved testing facilities, and restrict eligible exporters to companies with established track records in international trade. Each requirement appears reasonable in isolation, but collectively they transform routine commercial transactions into bureaucratic marathons that few companies can navigate successfully. In late 2025, Chinese authorities announced comprehensive changes to export licensing procedures. For strategic materials, including precious metals, establishing new qualification standards for approved exporters effective in 2026. The announcement specified that export licenses would require demonstration of prior export experience, compliance with environmental standards, maintenance of minimum production capacities, and approval of end-use applications for international buyers. These requirements effectively concentrated export authority among a smaller group of state-approved companies, while eliminating smaller traders and independent operators from international markets. Market analysts immediately recognized this framework as a soft ban, not because exports would legally cease, but because the practical barriers to export approval would reduce available suppliers, increase compliance costs, and introduce unpredictable delays into delivery schedules. Just-in-time supply chains that depend on reliable material flows cannot function when shipments become subject to bureaucratic approval processes with uncertain timelines and political considerations. Silver occupies a uniquely vulnerable position within this export control framework due to its dual role as both monetary metal and critical industrial input. Unlike gold, which serves primarily as a store of value, silver functions as an essential component in solar panel manufacturing, electronic systems, and advanced battery technologies. The global transition toward renewable energy systems and electric vehicles has created unprecedented industrial demand for silver at precisely the moment when monetary uncertainty drives investment demand higher. The mathematics of silver markets reveal chronic supply deficits that have persisted for consecutive years, with industrial consumption consistently exceeding mine production and recycling recovery. This structural imbalance means global markets depend on refined silver exports from major producing nations to bridge the gap between domestic production and consumption requirements. When export flows become subject to political management rather than market forces, even minor disruptions create disproportionate price movements and supply chain failures. The timing of export control implementation reflects strategic calculation rather than coincidence. As solar manufacturing capacity expands domestically, governments naturally prioritize internal industrial requirements over international commercial obligations, viewing refined silver as strategic industrial feedstock rather than exportable commodity. This shift from market-based allocation to state-directed distribution fundamentally alters global supply dynamics, transforming reliable commercial relationships into politically contingent arrangements that can be modified unilaterally based on domestic policy priorities and international relations considerations. State trading mechanisms transform competitive export markets into controlled distribution networks by concentrating approval authority among a select group of government-sanctioned companies, while eliminating independent operators from international commerce. The transition from open market access to managed export systems occurs through systematic implementation of eligibility requirements that appear commercially reasonable but function as effective barriers to market participation. Governments implementing these controls typically begin by establishing minimum production capacity thresholds, demanding extensive compliance documentation, requiring demonstrated export experience over multiple years, and mandating approval of end-use applications from international buyers. The concentration effect created by these eligibility requirements fundamentally alters market dynamics by reducing the number of counterparties available to Western buyers, transforming competitive supplier relationships into dependency on a limited pool of state-approved exporters. When dozens of potential suppliers become fewer than 10 approved entities, bargaining power shifts decisively towards sellers who can dictate terms, adjust delivery schedules according to political priorities, and demand premium pricing for guaranteed supply access. This concentration creates artificial scarcity even when underlying production capacity remains unchanged, as administrative bottlenecks replace market competition as the primary determinant of supply availability. Administrative delays function as powerful weapons in managed export systems because approvals need not be denied outright to achieve supply disruption objectives. Extended review periods, requests for additional documentation, mandatory site inspections, and bureaucratic processing delays create missed shipments, broken hedge positions, and panic bidding among international buyers who cannot predict when approved exporters will receive authorization to fulfill contracts. These delays introduce uncertainty into previously reliable supply chains, forcing downstream manufacturers to maintain larger inventories, accept higher working capital costs, and pay premium prices for supply guarantee arrangements. The signaling effect of reclassifying materials as managed strategic commodities triggers immediate risk reassessment throughout the financial system as banks and trading houses adjust credit terms, increase collateral requirements, and raise financing costs for transactions involving controlled materials. Once governments explicitly treat silver as strategic infrastructure rather than tradable commodity, Financial institutions respond by tightening lending standards, demanding additional security deposits, and requiring pre-approved end-use documentation before extending trade finance facilities. These changes cascade through the entire supply chain, increasing transaction costs and creating additional barriers to market participation. Historical precedent demonstrates the effectiveness of managed export systems through the rare earth metals crisis of 2010 through 2012, when export licensing requirements triggered price increases exceeding 800% and forced Western manufacturers to redesign products, seek alternative suppliers, and invest billions in domestic production capacity. More recent implementations of export controls on gallium, germanium, and graphite follow identical patterns, using licensing systems rather than outright bans to achieve supply disruption while maintaining legal compliance with international trade agreements. These modern templates prove that sophisticated export management can achieve the same market disruption as crude trade warfare while avoiding the diplomatic costs and legal challenges associated with explicit export prohibitions. The strategic calculus behind export controls extends beyond resource protection narratives to encompass domestic industrial prioritization, where governments systematically redirect critical materials from export markets to support rapidly expanding domestic manufacturing sectors. This reallocation reflects fundamental shifts in national economic strategy. As countries transition from commodity exporters to value-added manufacturers, naturally prioritizing internal industrial requirements over international commercial obligations. The public justification focuses on resource conservation and environmental protection, but operational reality demonstrates that fastest-growing domestic industries receive preferential access to strategic inputs, regardless of global market prices or existing export commitments. Solar manufacturing dominance exemplifies this industrial priority doctrine, as nations controlling photovoltaic supply chains develop powerful incentives to retain strategic inputs rather than export raw materials to international competitors. Countries that manufacture solar panels, inverters, and battery systems recognize that exporting refined silver while importing finished solar equipment represents fundamental strategic miscalculation, surrendering value-added manufacturing profits to preserve commodity export revenues. This industrial logic drives policymakers to prioritize domestic fabricators over international buyers, viewing strategic material exports as subsidies to foreign competitors rather than profitable commercial transactions. Silver occupies a critical position within photovoltaic manufacturing due to its unique combination of electrical conductivity, thermal stability, and reliability under extreme weather conditions. Solar panels require silver paste for electrical connections that must maintain performance over 20 to 30-year operational lifespans. Exposed to temperature variations, humidity cycles, and ultraviolet radiation that would degrade alternative materials. While manufacturers continuously research substitution technologies and efficiency improvements that reduce silver content per panel, these engineering advances cannot eliminate silver requirements entirely, as no alternative material matches silver's performance characteristics in high reliability applications where failure costs exceed material savings. The demand ratchet effect creates persistent upward pressure on industrial silver consumption, despite technological improvements that reduce silver loading per individual panel. As solar deployment accelerates globally, total silver consumption continues expanding even when manufacturers successfully reduce silver content per unit through advanced paste formulations and thrifting techniques. Mathematical reality demonstrates that doubling solar installation rates while reducing silver content by 30% still results in net increases in total silver demand, creating structural consumption growth that outpaces efficiency improvements and recycling capacity expansions. Policy alignment between energy security objectives and industrial expansion naturally leads governments to reserve strategic inputs for domestic priorities rather than export markets, particularly when those materials enable technologies central to national security and economic competitiveness. Nations pursuing renewable energy transitions view silver not as exportable commodity, but as strategic industrial feedstock, essential for achieving energy independence and technological sovereignty. This perspective transforms export decisions from commercial calculations into strategic policy choices, where domestic industrial requirements take precedence over international market dynamics and traditional trading relationships. Western fabricators operating outside integrated supply chains face immediate consequences as strategic materials become subject to domestic priority allocation rather than market-based distribution. Higher premium costs, extended lead times, and unpredictable supply availability force manufacturers to restructure operations around strategic material scarcity rather than competitive market pricing. These companies must increase working capital allocations for inventory management, develop alternative supplier relationships at premium costs, and invest in substitution research that may not yield commercially viable solutions within required timeframes. Recycling operations gain strategic importance as primary supply becomes politically managed rather than commercially available. But recycled material cannot instantly replace refined supply flows that have developed over decades of market-based allocation. Scrap recovery systems require years to scale capacity, substantial capital investments in processing infrastructure, and reliable feedstock streams that depend on existing equipment reaching end-of-life cycles. The mathematical impossibility of immediately replacing millions of tons of refined material with recycled alternatives creates unavoidable supply gaps that strategic stockpiling and rationing systems cannot bridge without significant price adjustments and demand destruction. Across non-priority applications, London functions as the global bullion dealing hub where silver price discovery occurs, yet the vast majority of transactions represent claims on metal rather than physical bars moving through warehouses and refineries. This fundamental disconnect between financial trading and physical commodity flows creates an illusion of abundant liquidity that masks underlying supply constraints, as market participants trade contractual rights to future delivery rather than immediate possession of actual silver bars. The pricing mechanisms that determine global silver values operate independently from the physical infrastructure required to deliver metal to end users, creating systemic vulnerabilities when supply disruptions force convergence between paper claims and available inventory. The architecture of bullion markets distinguishes between spot transactions, futures contracts, and over-the-counter arrangements that serve different functions within the broader pricing ecosystem, yet all rely on assumptions about physical availability that become problematic during supply stress. Spot markets theoretically provide immediate delivery, futures contracts establish prices for predetermined delivery dates, and over-the-counter transactions enable customized arrangements between counterparties. But actual metal movement occurs through separate physical distribution networks that may not align with financial contract obligations when supply becomes constrained or politically managed. Allocated versus unallocated silver holdings represent the core mechanism through which bullion banks create artificial liquidity while maintaining fractional physical reserves, as unallocated holders function as unsecured creditors to financial institutions rather than owners of specific bars in designated storage locations. This structure enables banks to issue claims against the same physical inventory to multiple parties, creating leverage ratios that amplify available metal through financial engineering, while concealing the actual relationship between outstanding claims and deliverable supply. When supply disruptions occur, unallocated holders discover their positions represent credit risk to financial institutions rather than ownership rights to physical metal. Exchange-traded funds and institutional vaults maintain substantial reported silver inventory that appears to provide market liquidity. Yet most of these holdings are already committed through lending arrangements, derivative obligations, and institutional mandates that prevent rapid mobilization during supply stress. Vault tonnage statistics create impressions of abundant available supply, while actual deliverable float represents a small fraction of reported holdings, as lease agreements, collateral arrangements, and operational constraints limit the metal available for immediate market intervention when physical demand exceeds supply expectations. Lease rates serve as critical stress indicators within bullion markets, as borrowing costs spike dramatically when participants scramble for deliverable bars to fulfill contract obligations and meet physical demand requirements. These borrowing cost increases signal systemic strain within the physical supply network, functioning as early warning systems for broader market dislocations that typically precede significant price movements and structural changes in trading patterns. Extreme market dislocations create arbitrage opportunities that make previously irrational activities economically viable, including airlifting silver between geographic markets to capture price differentials that exceed transportation costs. When Chinese export restrictions reduce reliable supply flows to London markets, assumptions about sourcing flexibility become untenable, creating feedback loops where higher lease rates drive increased premiums, encouraging hoarding behavior that further reduces available float and amplifies systemic stress throughout the global bullion distribution network. The 2026 supply shock will manifest not through dramatic policy announcements, but through gradual recognition that fundamental supply assumptions underlying global silver markets no longer correspond to operational reality. Market participants conditioned to expect reliable material flows from established sources will confront systematic changes in export reliability, supplier concentration, and delivery predictability that collectively undermine the foundation of existing procurement strategies and pricing mechanisms. This realization process unfolds incrementally as individual companies encounter delays, premium increases, and contract modifications that initially appear as isolated incidents before revealing themselves as components of coordinated policy implementation. The complete causal chain connecting policy changes to market disruption follows predictable sequence as export licensing requirements reduce supplier reliability and concentrate market access among fewer approved entities, while domestic industrial priorities increase internal demand and reduce surplus materials available for international distribution. Western bullion market structures amplify these supply constraints because substantial inventory exists only on paper. Through unallocated holdings, lease arrangements, and derivative obligations that cannot provide actual metal when physical demand exceeds available supply. Market stress signals emerge first in lease rates, delivery premiums, and spot futures price dislocations before translating into headline price movements that capture public attention. Financial institutions typically respond to supply stress through managed panic protocols designed to preserve system stability while transferring risks to market participants least capable of absorbing losses. These responses include incentivizing cash settlement, alternatives to physical delivery, increasing borrowing costs and collateral requirements for metal-backed transactions, and promoting substitution narratives that encourage demand reduction among price-sensitive buyers. Simultaneously, sophisticated institutional players quietly negotiate long-term supply contracts and offtake agreements at premium prices, while retail participants remain distracted by headline volatility and public policy debates about export restrictions. Critical indicators expose underlying supply mechanisms through observable market behavior changes that precede broader price movements and system failures. Monitoring approved exporter lists reveals the practical impact of licensing requirements on supplier availability, while London Vault inventory data shows the relationship between reported holdings and functionally available metal. Lease rate spikes, spot futures dislocations, and unusual physical metal movements between geographic regions provide early warning signals of systemic stress, while solar deployment statistics compared to recycling capacity growth demonstrate the widening gap between industrial demand and supply replenishment rates. Markets already experiencing chronic supply deficits require only modest supply disruptions to trigger systematic breakdowns, as choke point effects amplify relatively small policy changes into disproportionate market consequences. When material supply becomes subject to political management rather than commercial competition, and when industrial demand assumes strategic rather than economic priority, pricing mechanisms transition from market signals reflecting supply and demand balance to rationing tools that allocate scarce resources among competing users. Public discourse will focus on semantic debates about whether policies constitute bans, while professionals concentrate on operational questions about delivery reliability, volume availability, and premium stability that determine actual business viability and supply chain functionality.